Welcome. In this section, we're going to be analyzing conceptualization, operationalization, and measurement. These concepts are incredibly important because it is the bridge that connects theory to the empirical research. Now, much of what we're going to look at in here is going to be more focused on quantitative ways of doing this and qualitative ways, but it's important to know that quantitative and qualitative research are equally valid in the social sciences. So, first off, when we're talking about concepts, what is conceptualization? So, conceptual definition is the definition of a phenomenon that fully captures every idea that is connected to a concept. So, oftentimes we have an idea of something like social power, and we might think we know what it is. But if we haven't thought through the concept and clarified the contours of that definition, it's not going to be very useful. So that is what we're talking about when we're looking at conceptual definition. When we're thinking of these conceptual definitions, we can have either absolute or relative standards to the concept. So you can have a concept which is, for instance, of poverty, that provides a particular dollar amount, or that concept can take into account cost of living and so forth, and context of the average societal level of consumption and quality of life, and therefore fluctuate in those both ways. So that would be more of a relative standard, whereas an absolute standard would be a particular numerical value for families below X dollar amount are living below the poverty line. So when we look at these concepts, we have to think that in sociology, we have to break them down. And we need to break them down in order to get them into measurable pieces. So ideas such as alienation. Well, alienation can include lots of different things. It's actually got several different tiers. We can talk about alienation in terms of selling. You can talk about alienation in terms of exploitation. You can talk about alienation in terms of a disconnection. So which part of this concept are you going to really want to measure later? And will the measurement actually capture all the ideas of the concept? So the same we can do with these other concepts: exploitation, deviance, development. All of these are ideas we talk about in sociology, and they can include a vast array of ideas. So for example, development. If you look at, so generally when we talk about development, we think of societal development. You can also talk about a child's development, but in sociology, we usually talk about societal development. And we could say that this is just gross national income per capita or something like that, or gross domestic product, and have a single unsatisfactory absolute standard. Or we can say that this refers to quite a bit of concepts, like including the average income level, but also the rates of poverty, levels of income and wealth inequality, the extent of transportation infrastructure and public health infrastructure, the average level of education among the population, literacy rates, female literacy rates, etc. And perhaps also capture the amount of public debt that there is, the amount the state owes to other countries and international financial institutions. So all of these things are really actually part of this overall concept of development. So when we're thinking of conceptualization, we have to go through these mental exercises in order to get at something more specific that we can then later measure. Another example is this idea of social capital. This is a very popular concept in sociology, and that refers to social networks, norms of reciprocity, mutual assistance, and trustworthiness. Right there we have actually kind of concepts inside of concepts, and you sort of have one of these Russian dolls that you take one out and then you've got more inside, or you're peeling an onion. That's the kind of idea here. So when we think of concepts, we want to make sure that we know what the unit of analysis is. And a unit of analysis is that entity that we're studying, but it's at what level. So you can study things at the state level, you can study it at the individual level, you can study it at the country level, and all these different levels then clarify, one concept at one level of analysis is different than a concept at another level of analysis. We just saw that with development, for instance. You're looking at an individual's development, it's very different than if you're looking at a country's development. So that's a pretty important idea. And when we're thinking of these concepts, we also want to be aware of the social economic context. That can also influence definitions. So, for example, development in a context of poverty or progress towards development in a context of a poor country is very different than in the context of a wealthy country. And so the definitions may vary. As I mentioned earlier, the quantitative versus qualitative conceptualization processes are actually quite different. For the most part, this is going to focus on quantitative, but the importance is when we look at the process of operationalization, it starts with conceptualization in quantitative thinking. So we think of what the concept is that we want, we clarify what that is. Then we capture specifically how we're going to measure that concept. That's what we call operationalization. And as we move there, and then we capture the data at the end. So we can measure it, then we analyze it, and so forth. We go through a research process. But we go from conceptualization to operationalization to data collection to analysis. This is the quantitative way. The qualitative conception is very different. So the qualitative way of doing this is actually the other approach. So there you start by gathering the specific data through an interview, through observations, direct observations that you make. Then you sit down and see what sort of concepts emerge from that data that are sociological. How does this reflect that concept? So it's a different pathway to conceptualization.